So for those of you who follow my channel, you've probably seen at least once or twice my reviews of Aragon and Eldest, the first two books of the Inheritance Cycle, a book series that still holds a place in my heart, being one of the big fantasy names that I remembered reading going through my school years. And honestly, I figured it was about time that I finally talk about the third book of the series, but honestly, this one was actually the first of the Inheritance Cycle books I had ever read. So I had a lot to catch up on with this one. But reading book 3 of Brisingr honestly really sparked me to actually go back and read the other books. Funnily enough, in reverse. So let's go ahead and talk about Brisingr, shall we? So like I mentioned before, Brisingr was actually the very first of the Inheritance Cycle books that I'd ever read. Back then, as a kid, I did not realize that this was actually the third book of the series. So reading through the preface, learning about Aragon's story from the first and second books, I was fascinated and kind of eager to read more, wondering what exactly I'd missed, since the only exposure I'd had to Aragon was in fact the movie itself. But Brisingr definitely sold me just from the characters alone of Aragon and Roran. But I will say this right now, Brisingr itself was definitely a very packed book. Like, I'm not kidding when I say that there were at least 3 major points throughout this book that were addressed, and essentially it was like a huge exposition dump to prepare us for the fourth and final book of the series. But honestly, there were a lot of amazing plot points in this one, and if the rumors of the Inheritance series that I've heard about being made by Disney are true, God knows some of these plot points would make either a very packed season, or at least maybe 2. Anyways, so Brisingr opens up where Aragon and Roran have reunited back in Book 2 and are now on a mission to rescue Roran's beloved Katrina, whom at this point is imprisoned within Helgrind, the home of the Razak, as well as also right in the heart of enemy territory, because considering the fact that it is right next to Drastleona, one of the bigger cities of the Empire, yeah, Aragon, Saphira, and Roran definitely had to hide around here. But I will say this, reading through it of their interactions as well as their observations of Helgrind and the priests who worshipped the Razak there, they're odd, like, honestly, Helgrind's priests are just absolutely disturbing. Like, their head priest is literally a guy who has no arms, no legs, and it's just absolutely mind-boggling with people who just chop off an arm or a finger or something, and I'm just left wondering, what is wrong with these people? But later on, we actually see how Aragon and the others break into Helgrind, face off against the Razak and the Leatherblaka, kill them all except for one. During the process, they rescue Katrina, so mission accomplished. However, Aragon actually stumbles upon another prisoner, aka Sloan, the Butcher, the man who essentially betrayed his village to the Razak, allowed Katrina to be captured in the first place, and he did all of this just to spite Roran, because he did not approve of Roran and Katrina's relationship or betrothal to each other. And honestly, I found myself really not sympathizing with the man, and in fact hating him completely. Because I remembered how in the first movie, like when I watched it, I remember how he initially just sold Aragon out. Like, he sold him out, told him, hey, if you're looking for a stone, look for it in the farm, furthest from the village. And now I'm left wondering about this guy essentially betraying his whole village just to spite Aragon's cousin. Like, honestly, you could consider Sloan like the bane of Aragon's family. Just absolutely atrocious and despicable. But Aragon decides to spare Sloan out of some weird form of pity, but he lies to his cousin and Katrina, and essentially telling them Sloan was dead. Katrina just kind of moves on from this, which I can totally understand. I mean, if it were not for her father's actions, she would not be in that situation she was in. But during this, Aragon makes the decision to spare Roran, but also to hunt down the last Razak. So he tells Roran and Katrina to go off back to the Varden's home camp and all that stuff. And then we actually see his interactions with the last Razak, where essentially the Razak wants to spare Aragon. Like, he begs Aragon to spare him so long as he at least gives some information about Galbatorix, from what I remember. Because the way the Razak says it, as he has almost found the name, the true name, honestly sends a shiver down your spine, and you keep wondering, what is Galbatorix up to? But when Aragon decides not to keep that promise, the Razak curses him, saying, "May you leave Alagasia and never return." Which, for those of you who read the 4th book, you know how that song and dance goes. Anyways, so after killing the Razak, freeing Sloan, and then escaping from Helgrind, away from the priests who are like mere miles away, he talks to Sloan, and during the process he actually discovers something about Sloan. He discovers Sloan's true name. Now, for those of you who don't know, a true name is something that is like the name of the person in the ancient language, and it exposes their entire character. They cannot lie about it. It is essentially their whole soul barren before them, like just ripped away all the veils and lies about themselves that they believed. Their true name essentially exposes the true character of a person. And the way Sloan reacts, despite the fact that he is malnourished and he's blinded, but just hearing the agony in his voice of knowing that he's essentially been outed as the massive traitor and liar that he is, the sheer cowardice, everything about him is just exposed in that moment. But using this, Aragon tells Sloan to make his way to Elismira, the land of the elves, Duweld and Varden. And from there he will possibly be looked after. Meanwhile, after this, Aragon starts to make his way back to the Varden. But along the time of this, Saphira has made her way back to the Varden camp and told Nasuada and Arya that Aragon has decided to return to the Varden on foot by saying he's wanting to track down the last of the Razak. But anyways, the funny thing I notice about this is how Arya immediately takes off from the Varden camp after learning where Aragon is. Like, she just struts herself up and just runs to where Aragon is. And I'm just like, well, damn, that's a surprise. But I will say, you guys, my favorite part of this whole entire story was actually the moments when Aragon was on foot. Like, the scope of the world of Alagasia, like, it's never really fully addressed. It's always kept into this minor piece of it, right? Like, we see all the grandiose battles and cities. We get the scope of the travel, but it's honestly those moments throughout the books, the journeys that are taken, that always fascinated me, especially with Paolini's writing style of describing the world as it is, this vast and magical world full of endless detail and surprises everywhere. We even learned how Aragon at one point had to like skirt past the capital of Urubain just to make his way back to the Varden. And I'm just like, well, that's interesting. But throughout it all, we see him just absorbing everything around him, just learning about life in Alagasia, and essentially just being a man on foot, which we had not seen him do since the first book, when he was journeying with Bronn. A lot of people may not see this, but a lot of the times Aragon has mostly been on flight, on the back of Saphira, so the world has always seemed small. But going down to the ground, you get the sense of how vast Alagasia really is to a simple man. But throughout it all, we see Aragon eventually reuniting with Arya in a small town. And frankly, I love their interactions between the two characters, like how they grow to rely on one another, and in a way, actually grow closer to each other because of the journeys together. And honestly, it was kind of interesting to see their characters' interactions, and especially not knowing of how deep Aragon's, essentially his attraction to Arya was. Like, it's hinted at a lot throughout the third book, but it's never really brought up as severely as it was in book 2. But here you get that sense that he still cares about her, but is learning how to keep his distance and his feelings at least under wraps for the time being. Anyways, but that's only like one major part of the story. The second one, and I will not lie to you guys, Brisingr definitely had some of the most disturbing imagery I will ever think of. Not just the priests of Helgrind, but what came in here. Like the new enemy for the Varden themselves, like the new soldiers of the Empire they were facing. So Aragorn and Arya do make it back to the Varden encampment. But not even like a week or so after Aragorn returns, they are immediately attacked by a small force of soldiers, and of course, Murtagh and Thorn. So after the reveal, it's kind of sad to see how Murtagh is essentially a slave to Galbatorix. He's someone who hated his father Morzan for the crap that he pulled. Hell, Murtagh still has the scar on his back from when Morzan threw his sword at him when he was just a child. Jesus. But it's really sad to see how these characters just interact, and you see Aragorn just begging who he believes his brother is. And honestly, he's just begging him to say, hey, break away from Galbatorix and come with us to be free. And we actually even see, more than Murtagh himself, the conflict on his face. I love how this also brings a spotlight to Thorn, someone who was essentially born into this world, but then kept as a slave. Like, he has no idea why he's doing what he's doing. Essentially, Thorn, if you consider this, like he was magically grown to full size, just to be able to take on Saphira and any other dragons, you realize that while he might have an adult body physically, mentally, the poor dragon is still just a child. Like, literally, he is still a child in an adult's body. And it's one of the saddest things ever that he's being forced to attack some people that he really does not know, and is essentially being forced into this world as just another creature, an engine of war. Not only that, but we do get to see one of the creepiest parts that Paolini ever came up with, and it was essentially soldiers who cannot feel pain. Like, these guys were like small in numbers, but fierce in endurance, because literally you could hack off a limb, or put an arrow in their knee, give them a killing blow, and they would not feel it. They just wouldn't die. Which, I'm not gonna lie to you guys, when I looked at that, the one thing that I could think of was the Death Guard from Warhammer 40,000. And to put it simply, the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the Death Guard are like the men who feel no pain. Because these guys are just covered in like rotting festers and boils and nasty diseases that should essentially leave them completely vegetative, or at least completely dead. But they don't feel it. All they feel is just this slow, lumbering walk as their bodies are rotting and decaying, and they cannot feel it. It's quite similar to the men who feel no pain here. And I will tell you right now, some of the stuff that was described, like some of the fights with these guys, were just absolutely disturbing. Not only this, but we even see Roran coming into his own as a commander of troops. And at one point, we see him not only slaying a whole bunch of soldiers while standing on a freaking mountain of them, literally just smashing guys' faces in with his freaking warhammer. And I'll tell you guys again, Roran has to be one of my honest-to-God favorite characters in this whole story. He does not have magic like Aragorn, nor does he have like magical enhancements like the elves or the dwarves or anything like that. No, he's just a regular guy with a hammer and shield. And what does he do? He accomplishes fates that are practically superhuman. Like I said before, this guy was standing on a freaking mountain of corpses, knocking back enemy soldiers to secure a win for the Varden. And I'm just there cheering like, holy crap, how much more can this guy take? Not only that, but later on we even see him taking on a small force of the soldiers with no pain. And essentially how he and his troops were forcing these enemy soldiers back into the river and hacking and slashing at them with just no remorse. And we see these soldiers just rising out of the river, like barely resembling men anymore at one point. And it is some of the most disturbing things you will ever imagine in your head. Like, I could physically see it in my mind. Just these zombified, just mutated men just crawling out of the river. Like, seriously, Paolini's writing style, I should say, is just fantastic at giving the gory details when it is needed. But honestly, here's one of the other biggest plot points. Like, there are two major plot points to go through next. One is Aragorn essentially having to go to the land of the dwarves to help with selecting the new king. And Aragorn himself was actually adopted by the previous king of the dwarves, King Hrothgar, before his death, into his own personal clan. So he and his clan brother, Oric, are essentially trying to secure Oric's leadership as king of the dwarves. And I'll not lie to you guys, honestly, the whole dwarven politics thing of selecting their new king was honestly one of the more driest parts of this book. Like, seriously, it was definitely one of the driest pieces ever. Like, just these dwarven politics going back and forth. The most exciting thing happening was Aragon essentially being almost assassinated by a group of dwarves who really have a huge bone to pick with Aragon, but more importantly, dragon riders in general, considering that years ago, this clan was actually nearly wiped out by Galbatorix and the Forsworn. Because of this, they have a massive grudge against dragon riders in general, which I can totally understand, but it does not excuse their actions. So, to make a long story short, Oric does become the new king of the dwarves, which is awesome. And then after that, Aragon essentially journeys back to Elismira to meet with Oramus and Glader. And I have to say, honestly, this part is where some of the biggest chunk of exposition comes from, because we actually learn something of a secret about the dragons themselves. How essentially a lot of the dragons that were supposedly killed might still be alive even now. And we actually learn the reason why is because these dragons have something called an Eldunari, known as a Heart of Hearts. For those of you who want a better idea, think of a soul gem, like this dragon's soul contained in a massive, like, jewel, right? So we actually learn not only this about the dragon's Eldunari, or Heart of Hearts, but we also learn that Aragon's true father is in fact Brahm. And me compensating with that with just the movie's knowledge, I was just like, huh, that's really cool. It didn't really hit me until like the first book of how huge of a reveal that is. So we actually learned that Mertag and Aragon are not in fact blood brothers, but are in fact half-brothers. Not from the same father, but from the same mother. And I'm just sitting there thinking, well, this is a lot of dumping of exposition here. Because like I said, this thing is thick with plot exposition. And explaining about the Eldunari was definitely a huge chunk that took out a lot. Honestly, just explaining this whole Heart of Hearts thing and how Galbatorix's true power lies in using the souls of dragons to fuel his own power, that alone was a crazy concept, and left me wondering, well, how the hell are they going to beat this guy? But then later on, we also see how Aragon, after forging himself a new rider's blade thanks to an elven blacksmith, which, thank God for that. But honestly, afterwards, we see Oramus and Glader preparing to take off with the elves to essentially start attacking the Empire from the north. Like the dwarves attack, like the elves will attack from the north, and the humans, the Varden, will attack from the south, thereby creating a sort of pincer movement against Galbatorix's empire. And they are essentially planning to join the elves in Gilead to essentially stop hiding and bring their way back into the fold and kind of spark a bit of fear in Galbatorix is what their plan is. But before this, Glader actually disgorges his Eldunari and gives it to Aragon and Saphira as a gift. So essentially it is literally Glader giving his soul, the very container of his soul, to Aragon and Saphira. Which, that is a huge bond of trust right there. Very huge thing. But to essentially keep going with this, so Aragon and Saphira go back to help out the Varden with another campaign, another battle that they are experiencing. Meanwhile, Oramus and Glader go to Gilead. And from there, I gotta say, Paolini, I don't know how the heck he did this, but he managed to actually combine two major battles into one, or at least 2 or 3 chapters. And I'm just sitting there reading this whole thing, being drawn in on both one battle to the next. And it kind of got confusing at first, but the way Paolini wrote it was definitely a way to keep your attention, and it didn't feel quite as dizzying as I thought it was going to be. But throughout it all, we see not only Aragon and Saphira, and even Arya, fighting off against another shade created by enemy sorcerers, but we see Artemis and Glader taking on Murtagh and Thorn, which tragically leads to Artemis and Glader's death above Gilead. And the way this actually happens is that during the fight, Galbatorix actually possesses Murtagh and Thorn, or at least Murtagh, and starts talking to Artemis through Murtagh. And I gotta say, you guys, this really sells Galbatorix as the terrifying monster that he is. Because for the first half of the conversation, when Artemis and the others are all just talking, we see Galbatorix having that smooth politician's voice of convincing them, trying to turn Artemis and Glader to his side. But then, once Artemis eventually just rebukes Galbatorix and says, "No way are we joining you, Eggbreaker," then Galbatorix swiftly turns his attitude around from being a smooth convincer or politician to straight up wrathful and angry. And it really just shows how Galbatorix is a terrifying figure to face. And it really adds more of that build-up as Galbatorix, and adds more power to the myth that he is at this point. And honestly, Artemis and Glader's deaths was definitely sad, especially for me, because I just got to know these characters, because keep in mind, this is the first book I'd ever read. I got to know these old mentors, and as swiftly as I did, they just died. And honestly, that was incredibly sad to see. But throughout it all, while Eragon and the Varden do win the major battle, they lose their mentor and friends. And it's definitely a very sad moment indeed. But honestly, like I said, this book was extremely packed, and this might actually be the longest time I've ever talked about a singular book. But with all being said and done, let's move on to the final score. So my overall score for Brisingr would be a solid 8 out of 10. Because like I said, this was the first Inheritance book I'd ever read, so I'm a little biased here. But the main reason why I take down a couple of points and make it not a 10 out of 10 is because there was a lot of plot exposition that was just dumped into this book. So this book felt very packed, very full, like it was trying to get all the major points done in what might have been a multi-book series, like at least maybe 5 or 6. But I can see why Paolini was trying to get all this out there, but at the same time, it makes for a very exhaustive read. I will say that right now. But honestly, again, it is a fantastic piece of the Inheritance cycle, and it left me honestly wondering what would happen next in Book 4. It left me very excited to read more, and it actually sparked my reason to go back and read the first 2. So Brisingr itself holds a very special place in my heart for introducing me to this fantastic series. Anyways, you guys, I hope at some point to review Book 4 and give my final thoughts on that. And if you have stuck around to this long, thank you so much for listening again to this crazy man's ramblings, and I hope you all have an awesome day. Keep it up, fellow readers. Keep reading, and if you have any book challenges for me, please let me know in the comment section down below. And if you like the stuff I do here, feel free to subscribe for more. Anyways, you guys, thank you so much again for listening. This is Rambling Collector, signing off.